Welcome to the Reaching the Last Mile in Sub-Saharan Africa through Inclusive FinTech panel. We have a fantastic group of panelists here with us. And rather than introduce them, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So first, let me say who I am. I'm Tamara Cook with FSD Kenya. FSD Kenya is a market facilitator funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Swedish SIDA, and UK Aid. And we are all about creating value through inclusive finance and inclusive fintech. Great. Buhle, please introduce yourself and tell us what the last mile means to you and your business.
Thanks, Tamara. So my name is Buhle Goslar, and I'm the CEO for the Africa region and Pakistan at Jumo. So Jumo is a technology stack for building and running financial services, digital financial services, and we partner with banks and mobile operators in order to reach customers with financial services like lending and saving. As a business, we've served over 16 million customers, many of them emerging consumers, and we're live in 6 African markets as well as Pakistan, as I mentioned before. So what does the last mile mean to us? I think it's really about making sure that no one is left behind, and about making sure that technology is used in a way that it doesn't inadvertently exclude people. So both technology and data, we spend a lot of time really trying to understand how we can ensure that no one is left behind.
Great. Let's go to you, Jose. Are you? Oh, I think we've lost. Yeah, no, you're still there. Jose, please.
Yeah, I'm still here.
You moved to a different square in my screen.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jose Morell-Ducos, and I'm the Financial Inclusion Portfolio Manager for Branching Out Financial Inclusion at the Margins, which is a partnership between Comic Relief and Jersey Overseas Aid. And together we're funding financial inclusion initiatives in Zambia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, as well as worldwide initiatives like IF50, and more recently, some research projects relating to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on financial inclusion. The last mile to us really represents reaching those people that are most marginalized, and that is to say, geographically, socially, economically, and reaching them in a way that is appropriate and approachable. So that is to say, really with services that are considered and accompanying financial literacy efforts that also demystify what can so often be a very overwhelming world of financial services. So really it's about going beyond being physically there, beyond offering those services, but also then bridging the knowledge gap necessary for customers to be able to make those decisions that are really most appropriate to their individual situations.
Great, thanks, Jose. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Tamara. Yeah, Nick Quintong. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders at Pico Energy. Pico Energy is a venture-backed technology company based in Nairobi, Kenya. Our focus is around unlocking clean cooking for the next billion, so getting underserved communities over to a cleaner cooking fuel, which is gas in our case. And our technology platform essentially turns any gas cylinder into a pay-as-you-go device, so that anyone can now purchase gas in small amounts that's affordable for them. What the last mile means to us is we're a much more kind of physical business. We actually have to deliver gas to people's homes, or our partners do. And what we're trying to do is fix the product market fit challenge, so that folks that today are marginalized by the way LPG is sold, that we're actually able to bridge that gap. So we're very focused on access, and we're also focused on the supply chain, which is how do we make it more efficient to ultimately drive a better service for customers and at also a lower cost.
Mm-hmm. Great. And last but not least, Ralph, please introduce yourself. And you're still on mute.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Yes, I'm Ralph Pecker, CEO and founder of Paycode. The last mile for us is what I would say is the underserved population of the world. And in particular, where we spend most of our time at the moment in Africa, is 590 million people over the age of 15, according to the World Bank, they still do not have financial services or access to financial services. So that's the last mile as far as I'm concerned. However, you need to achieve certain key components to bring in that underserved market. And the first and most important is identification, because how do you identify somebody on the third mango tree to the left? So some form of identification. Second would be the affordability, because a lot of that market can't afford the various first world services that the world provides. And most important is the connectivity. You want to be able to give those people 24/7, because if they're using cash, they have access to their money. If you're going to digitize it, you need to make sure it's connected 24/7 in some way or form. And last but least, and the most important, that's a passion and Paycode, is once you bring these people to the financial service, you provide them with some element of dignity and identification and financial services.
Great. Thank you. Some really great answers there. And I love that it wasn't just about the geography, right? When you hear the word mile or kilometer, you may think it's about just a geographic last mile. But what I'm hearing is that there's lots of other ways to conceptualize this last mile. What did you hear from each other? Any questions for each other? Or do you want to bounce off any of the ideas you heard?
Well, I think, if I may say, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Tamara, is that last mile can mean a lot. Financial services or financial inclusion can mean a lot. And I think 5 years ago, we used to make that word fintech or financial inclusion as a generic word. However, in our experiences, I use the mango tree as an example. And if you look at our material, it's really putting that person under the mango tree, bringing that person into the financial services market. And, you know, having been brought up in Zambia myself under the mango tree, I know what it means to sit under the mango tree in Zambia with my mom, who was 92 and never owned a bank account or a phone until she passed away. So it's bringing my mother into that financial service and giving her some element of dignity. She didn't see the need or could afford the services to the last mile. So the last mile is, we need to address that. It's a huge population that the world has to deal with. It's not just Africa, it's global, and it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Jose, go ahead.
No, I completely agree with everything Ralph has said. And I would also add, building that trust as well. So a lot of what I've been hearing, especially over the last few months with COVID-19, as the world is adapting, has also been about how all of these services may be available, but that clarity, how is it that they actually work? How can they actually support the various lives? How can they be seen as a positive for their lives? That's also, I think, a great part of the last mile, to be able to do that demystification of finance as a whole, really.
Yeah. Buhle? I'm sorry if you can hear the birds in the background.
It's fine. Very authentic. I think one of the things that really struck me as we were all talking, Tamara, was that there's a theme of addressability, right? And I think that in different ways, we're all trying to solve that issue. In some cases, it is about what are the barriers to access? Can we create more doorways in order for people to be able to access the service? You know, I think, you know, in the case of Jumo, we're looking at eligibility for credit, for instance, and being able to work with both thin and thick data. But, you know, across the board, we're all addressing this, you know, whether it's about energy, we're addressing how do we make access easier? How do we remove that friction, right? So that was one of the themes that I really heard coming through. And then I think the second theme for me was more of a challenge, which is all of us are facing this in different ways. And the challenge is infrastructure. And I think all of us are trying to work with what exists in our markets, whether that is actual like, is there an address? How do I find the person? How do I physically get something to them? Or for us, in terms of our platform, it can be infrastructure in terms of payment rails, right? And going, how will we reach these customers? We can't use traditional banking rails. Then we need to leverage mobile money ecosystems because they are the most ubiquitous in the markets in which we're operating. And I think in different ways, all of us are trying to address the infrastructure challenge, but then also work with the customers to make them addressable and reachable in some way, shape, or form. The one thing that I think we didn't actually really talk about, which I think is important and often in this conversation doesn't get talked about, is the margin issue, right? Because when it comes to reaching people in the last mile, margin is an issue, right? And all of us are challenged by this because we know that
by
we need
margin,
scale.
you're talking about profitability? Like it's more expensive?
Correct.
You're talking about the
Yeah.
marginal cost of reaching somebody further away. That's what, okay. Just to clarify, go ahead.
Exactly. And I think, yes, yeah. And I think, Tamara, it's something that we need to talk about a lot more often, right? Because the other conversations that we've had speak a lot to, you know, what can you do, you know, the infrastructure, you can partner, you know, addressability, you can address that in the design of your product, right? So for us, we make sure that our products are device agnostic. So whether you have a smartphone or a feature phone, it works. Those are things that you can quite easily solve. But the issue of margin and profitability is not really a product innovation challenge, right? I think it really starts to speak to, you know, sometimes systemic change, sometimes business model innovation. And I think that's something we need to really talk about and think about if we want to, you know, reach the last mile and see the type.
Great. Thank you, Buhle. Nick, did you have anything to add, or do you want me to go to the next question?
No, just to add on real quick on to Bushle's last thought, which I thought was a really important one, especially for us. You know, what we've seen with our customer base, again, we're focused on access to clean cooking fuel, is that there is, you know, a marginal cost, you know, for us to put our technology onto the cylinder, for us to go and do delivery at the household level. But we've found that if we're able to kind of match the livelihood of our customer base, that there is enough, you know, purchasing power, and there is a willingness to pay, you know, a premium for convenience and for, you know, for our service. And so I think we've had to look a little bit beyond just the incremental that we can charge a premium for pay as you go to find additional places to increase our margin. And I mentioned earlier, we are also looking at the supply chain and how, you know, our product being more digital can it lead to huge efficiencies and working capital costs that, you know, traditional gas companies face. And so I think we have to broaden our lens a little bit. We can't put all of it on the customer; they can't bear it all. And so at PayGo, we've had to look, you know, broader at the supply chain, but it is a real challenge.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Well, when we got together before this panel to talk about this panel, one of the big topics that came up, which would be no surprise, is the intersection between COVID-19 and the reality we're having to deal with, and how that impacts our ability to reach the last mile. So the next question, and I'll let you guys fight to see who answers first. I won't pick on you. It is really, what is that intersection between COVID-19 and the last mile? How has it made it harder? Maybe how has it made it easier? What have we learned? Or what opportunities has COVID-19 created for us to be more creative about last mile? But what is that intersection? Whoever unmutes first, Jose, go for it.
Thank you. Well, yes, COVID-19 has been quite an impact. I think we've all sort of grown tired of hearing COVID-19 over the past few months, unfortunately, but it has accelerated something that we've noticed at Comic Relief and Jersey Overseas Aid, is that it really has accelerated the rate of digital adoption of financial services. And it's in doing so, it has caused unprecedented changes in customer and potential customer behavior. Or mainly in three big things. It has largely forced an adoption of online and mobile systems. It has encouraged closer partnerships between digital FSPs and G2P programs, leading towards potential new partnerships. And for those financial institutions that have historically struggled to adapt to digital, the pandemic has also exposed gaps in technology And the way we see it, all of these are really opportunities. This isn't to say that there isn't a place for physical as we move forward, but rather that the discovery of the greater potential of digital, at least in the countries in which we are working, is really leading towards some very, very interesting conversations that for us as a donor have actually led us to start funding some research programs to answer some very basic but necessary questions. For example, what kind of policy environments are most conducive to greater financial inclusion in this sort of re-rise of digital? What kind of activities, what kind of products have led customers to be more resilient at this time? So I think for us, it's really a very exciting time to be working, and we really are, in spite of everything that is happening around the world, we really are trying to see what the opportunities might be, not forgetting, of course, the physical and traditional ways of working, but really trying to explore what the place of digital looks like today.
Great. Next, Nick.
I'll go
And then
quick.
Ralph.
I think my son might be waking up in the background here. It's in the morning. So yeah, look, for us at PayGo, it's been interesting. COVID-19 hasn't impacted demand as much on the LPG side, but we've actually seen its demand's been pretty static as it's residential cooking fuel. But where we've actually seen most of the movement, and also most of our customers, I think, are digital. That's how our payments are coming through. It's mostly been on the partner side. So a lot of gas companies, they're from it's a very old industry. It's kind of monolithic, and we've been finding a lot of inertia to get them over to our system. And I think the kind of acceleration we've seen to digitization has been happening more on the partner front, and it's led to a much stronger pipeline for us. Yeah. I'm going to go out.
Ralph?
I'm going to drop off until I get the cavalry here.
Sure. Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, and certainly I concur with what Jose said, and that is the digital demand has just increased through the COVID, and you've seen it both in the urban and maybe less of a factor in the rural, because as I said, we participate predominantly in the rural and the deep rural. I mean, we very seldom, other than in Ghana, do we be in the urban. However, what we have found is that most of our clients are DFIs, so most of the donor funders, the World Banks, the UN, because our business is about sending the digital value to the last mile security 24/7 and making sure that we onboard those people. So with 5.5 million people that we've got scattered around 8 countries, we find a lot of the DFIs coming to see us and say, well, you're already in the last mile, you already got infrastructure, you've got identification of 5.5 million people. Could we use you to then provide the supports So like in particular in Mozambique, we were doing a social grant system there for the World Bank. However, suddenly COVID has come and they've asked us could we use the existing infrastructure. And to Bulle's point, affordability is the most important thing. So if you're going to target that last mile, you've got to be between 50, even higher. And I don't want to use a number, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to say, well, there goes my margin. But you've got to be fairly 50 to 70, I don't know the figure, cheaper than the other services that you've got, because those people are on either $1 or $2 or $4 a day type of people. So support what her and Nick said, we getting lots of the DFIs coming to us and said, could we use your rail, could we use your infrastructure to distribute the COVID? So it's a great opportunity for all of us.
Buhle?
Yeah, I think one of the things that COVID-19 has shown is that, you know, more lower pricing makes a difference to who gets included. So one of the things that we saw across the mobile money ecosystems was the waiving of fees over this period. And I think that, you know, we'd be remiss to talk about the increase in adoption without talking about the decrease in fees over this period, right? So I think that we saw that it was very clear evidence that people who form part of this last mile are not price elastic, right? And it makes a difference. So it's up to us now to go and figure out ways in which we can make changes in our business models to lower the price. So for us, one of the things that we've been doing is really diversifying the type of capital that we use as growth capital for our loans portfolios, bringing in institutional and impact funders directly to fund the loans so that we can lower the prices. What we also did over this period, which had a fantastic impact on performance, was working with our bank partners to also waive penalty fees. And it's been interesting looking at the customer feedback, because we do two-way SMS survey feedback free to customers. And a lot of our customers, about 2/3 are micro entrepreneurs, how this really built product brand loyalty across the 13 or 14 brands that we're operating. The fact that we were with them over this really tough period. So I think that sometimes it's possible for people to think that people who are underserved would just be happy with any service, but that is not true, right? A good 30 to 40% of our base across markets is under $2 a day, and actually customer experience design and those type of gestures of we are with you through thick and thin do make a really big difference. So I think some really great lessons on pricing and customer experience coming out of COVID. Now, the other thing that I've been reflecting on is, now that we've seen this adoption in some of our markets, for instance, when it comes to merchant acquisition, so merchants starting to accept payments, we saw something like 15 to 20% month-on-month growth, which is amazing. Right. And what we're also seeing is customers also really starting to be more active in the usage of mobile money and more advanced as well in the types of services that they're doing, which means now they have far thicker data footprints. And what we need to start thinking about is, what are we going to do? Because now we see these customers, and how do we use this to design better products and really enhance the overall offering for the last mile. And I think a lot of businesses will need to think about that, but I also think a lot of governments need to think about, now that we have all of this data, how do we make sure that the customers are benefiting from it, and that we don't just kind of have data silos where people who are operating in spaces where they've amassed this data basically hold these customers captive, and their data and their footprint is not being used to unlock further opportunities for them.
Just building on that, we have a question from some of the attendees related to that. What instances have you seen where a community may not be interested in the technology due to concerns over trust of their personal information? So I think at least several of you do collect personal information, and how do you deal with customers and help them better understand how that information is used, and what kind of questions do you get about that?
Yeah. So that's a really, really good question. And I think that, this topic of kind of, designing with privacy in mind is really one that is gaining momentum. One of the things that we've always done from the early days is really try to build transparency into our customer journey. So even when it's not a rich experience, so on USSD, we use plain and simple language. We use language of choice wherever we can, so that the customers actually understand what we're saying. And also at each point, we don't just depend on the terms and conditions, which, as many of you don't read them, and neither do customers who are underserved. But we actually build it into each step of the journey, where we actually tell them what's happening now. So when the customer opts in, for instance, for a loan or saving service, we will now pass your data on to Jumo and EcoBank, or Jumo and ABSA, etc. And we kind of walk them through what is happening, so that consent is really explicit. I think that, when you do that, that definitely makes a difference. I do also think, though, some of it has to do with what you decide to do as an organization in terms of your principles. So one of our customer operating principles is responsible stewardship of customer data, which is why I'm so passionate about not having data silos, right? And I think if you can make sure that those principles are really clear to the customer, and they can see that you're not collecting more data than you actually need, and they can understand what you're using that data for, then you will definitely build the trust. So it really comes down to transparency, and then them being able to see the real tangible benefits of them sharing that data with you, whether that's loan size increasing or some other type of value proposition enhancement that comes from them sharing more information with you.
Ralph, you collect a lot of personal data as well, or because of your identity solution. How have people asked you about this? How do you answer this kind of question with customers?
Yeah, and to follow on what Buhle said on the trust, it takes time for us to get trust within our customer base. And what you'll find predominantly when we go live in the country, you'll find them getting their money, and within the same day they take 100% of the money off the card, off the wallet, and it's kind of like seems such a shame, because they sort of putting themselves at risk, possibly losing the money, whatever. However, over time, so a good example, we do the food grants in Botswana, and now we're finding most of those customers 4 or 5 years later have trusted the system and leave some of the value on the. So trust is a very good point that Willie brought up. With the trust also comes the trust of the data and the money. So one of the key things we've done is we've separated our payment mechanism or payment tech from the data, and the data servers, we insist they sit with the government in that country or the institution that is given us the contract to deliver the solution. And again, what Buhle said is the minimum amount of data that is required to deliver the service. So most of the data that we collect, so the 5.5 million people in, let's say Ghana, for a good example, we've got about 4 million people in Ghana. All that data and those data service sits with the Central Bank of Ghana, because it's not our data, it belongs to the country. And so it's their payment system, it's their switch, it's their, so that's one way of doing of getting over that question mark on the data. And there are some countries that have various POPI acts and various other things, so we try and avoid anybody accessing the data. So you'll find our company get very, very skeptical when I ask them, can you just download some data because we want to see how the transaction, have you got permission kind of thing. So yeah, data is an important question, and whoever that person put it, it is always a controversial point that comes up in the countries.
Sure. And it may link, and if Jose or Nick want to add anything to that, another question, which is how can financial literacy serve as a proxy for successful financial inclusion? Any thoughts on that, or the other question on data and privacy?
Just add one more note on the trust side. Again, our product is quite a bit different than the other folks on the call, but we spent a lot of time getting really deep into the community and being close to our customers. And I think there's a couple of benefits to our approach. One is we have the ability to kind of piggyback on existing brands. And so through our partnership model, if you just say work with someone as an example like Total, you get to kind of bring some of that goodwill in with you into the household. And I think with gas, there's a lot of concerns around obviously safety. And also when you're purchasing gas in small amounts, it's a bit of an abstract concept when you have a cylinder in a household and you're purchasing small amounts of gas that's somewhat abstracted from that. And so being able to use partners that have spent a lot of time, I think for a startup in developing their brand is very helpful. We've also, this might sound kind of silly, but we spend a lot of time on aesthetics, both on how our hardware looks and how our apps look. That actually having something that looks clean and well thought through engenders a lot of trust with customers, especially when you're a new kind of player that they're not used to. On the data side, we don't take too much data up front. I mean, we're not credit scoring in a more traditional sense. We're more trying to understand what we think a household's gas consumption is going to be, but we're also having to look at how we're keeping household data, because it's very different. We're showing consumption data day over day, and it actually is somewhat invasive and kind of a look into someone's daily life. And so as a company, we've had to look at it a little bit differently, and also to be very clear, Tamara, to your point about, and I think Buhle brought this up as well, that exactly what information we're going to be pulling from the household. It's not just the information you're getting up front, it's also going to be consumption data and how we're going to have that, how we're going to manage that in our back end. What is the look that our team and our partners will get access to? So we had to keep that in mind as well. But I think the engendering trust, especially as a startup, again, I think partnering with companies that spend a lot of time and money behind their brand, getting close to the customer and in the community, and then focus on building something that looks like aesthetically pleasing, actually, I think can help speed up that process.
Great. Jose?
Thank you. Well, as donors, we don't have any direct interaction with the customers. However, kind of related between the two questions, it's a lot in between there. It is this question of trust, exactly as Nick was saying. So it is necessary to build that trust within the financial services that are being provided, but also in terms of financial literacy, to be able to explain why it is that data is necessary, why it is that KYC is a thing that needs to be there. And I think that, especially with financial literacy, it also brings up the opportunity to have better contextualization of the services, more appropriate services that could also then feed back not only to the various FSPs, but to government as well, to the regulators as well, to be able to, again, better create that environment that would help out companies, that would help out FSPs to be able to provide that information. And all of this can only be possible with that trust, with that first step of financial literacy and understanding why it is that this data is being gathered.
Great. Well, the next topic we were intending to talk about is customer centricity, and I actually feel like it's very linked to the conversation we've just had. As we think about last mile, obviously, and I think Buhle, it was you who said we should go to them; they shouldn't have to come to us. And thinking about, and Nick, you were talking about being in customers' homes and understanding how they live, so that you could cater your product to them. As you think about the last mile and the implications of the last mile and customer centricity. What does it mean? How does it inform the way we approach the last mile as we're thinking about being customer centric? Nick, you want to start us off? If
Sure,
nobody's crying in the background?
Yeah, the cavalry came, so I'm okay. Yeah, so first we started going really deep into the household. That's really where people are cooking and trying to understand the day-to-day of our customer base, of the mass market opportunity, for LPG that the industry's been missing. And so I think even as a company, we knew that longer term B2B was going to be the path for us to scale. We actually set up a B2C retail operation to really get in there and understand it first. So I think that was critical for us. And I think there was two key insights. One is, on the customer side, we had some assumptions about what an intervention with LPG, what the outcome would look like. Folks, many people know about the kind of fuel stacking phenomena. What would actually happen when you put LPG in the household? Would they consume at a high enough threshold for the business model to work? And what were the different ways we could position our product to drive up consumption? What we found is that customers knew a lot more about LPG than we thought. That the barriers to entry were different than we thought. The upfront cost we thought was a much bigger barrier than it ended up being. It was more the recurring cost of LPG, which is kind of more of a kind of proof point for the pay-as-you-go model. And so there's a ton of learnings, and I think that those first couple of years that we spent in the home running our own retail business were really invaluable. We've now shifted, and we have to be customer-centric towards our partners, and LPG companies are less easy to kind of humanize. I mentioned earlier, kind of these big monolithic kind of old gas companies, and we have to treat them the same way. So we're getting very embedded in the gas companies, and we're trying to understand how they make their decisions, how they run their business, and ultimately how to get them to extend their supply chain, because that's what it means to get to the last mile. Part of it is to have the right product and that meets the livelihood of the customer, but part of it is to actually physically get more cylinders and more retail locations out. And to do that, we have to convince these gas companies that this is a market they should go after. and it changed the way that they sell gas today. And so that's been a huge lift. And we spend a lot of time taking the same approach, which is get inside, take our time, not, don't try to rush it. Don't make huge assumptions about our customers, even if they are a big gas company compared to, someone that's cooking at home.
Great. Ralph, do you want to talk, or go ahead, Buhle?
Yeah, I think for me, customer centricity, especially when it comes to the last mile, is really just about designing for the lives that those customers live, right? And that does mean immersing yourself into that and really understanding what some of the key issues are, right? So if we take, for instance, women and agripreneurs or rural dwellers, we know that in the African context, certainly, they continue to be left behind from both the digital divide and also just access to financial services. Why? Generally, they have less money, right? They're less likely to own a device, etc. And so when we think about how we are designing these solutions, we have to think about those things and think about, are you designing for device not present? Are you designing to allow multiple people to use the same device with different identity criteria? Because that is the reality, is that people are sharing devices, right? So you really have to think about some of those things. You have to think about the fact that if your product is offering it is reliant on too much data, that means that you're going to leave people behind. So how can you reach those people with less, right? How can you create more doorways to access your service? And that can be to do with your actual distribution of your service, or it can be to do with qualifying criteria. So for instance, we did some work around thin file customers to say, hang on, can we pull data from these customers? Because to require someone to use mobile financial services more, if their initial problem is just that they just don't have the cash, that's not going to work, right? So, what can we do to help them essentially create more of a footprint? So for me, that is customer centricity. Then the second thing that I would say is that, and it links to my earlier comment about don't offer customers the least worst option, is to understand that customers at the last mile do have other options, right? And that is what you're competing with. It's not the next fintech, it's the other options. When we were designing our savings product, somebody said to me, but people want to use goats as a store of value. And I said, well, then the savings product better be better than that, right? Because if the goat is performing better as a way to store value than our savings product, then we've got a problem. And you have to actually think about it and go, what is it about the goat that makes it such a great store of value, and how do we replicate that? Which I know sounds like a very silly example, but when you really think about it, those things matter. And I spent quite a while in Uganda with my customer intelligence analysts interviewing money lenders, because people kind of portray them as, the kind of this evil. And I said, but hang on, people are resorting to these people. Let's actually understand, what are they getting right? And what can we learn from them? So really embrace the alternatives that exist. And I think, Nick, you spoke about like alternative sources of energy. What is working about that, right? And what can you design into your product as far as that is concerned? So for me, designing for the lives that the customers live, and also acknowledging what your true competition is in the last mile, and making sure that you're better than that.
Yeah, those are great points. And if I had two takeaways from what you just said, it would be, we got to beat the goat and don't offer the least worst solution. Ralph, over to you. How do you think about customer centricity in your business, and how does it intersect with the last mile?
Yeah, so absolutely resonate with what Buhle said. Is, they in the last mile under the mango tree, everyone's got an option when it comes to payment. You don't have to have payment. And in particular, my mother was a very stubborn lady, and she would never want a mobile phone or a credit card. So she would she would say that she'll be the worst customer to try and get on into the financial inclusion. So yes, the options are, and another thing we found across all the different countries, and yes, I grew up in the rural areas of Zambia, we must not underestimate the literacy of Africa. And I'm taking particular Africa. They actually very quickly get it. They very quickly understand it. And you've got to try and convince, and that's where the trust comes in, why the goat situation or the cow is not as good as maybe going digital. And I think that we can say thanks to the mobile innovations that the last mile are starting to learn about digital and mobile phones and airtime and so forth. However, you come back to the point that Willie said, that it's cash. In our business, it's either cash or digitizing. One positive thing for us is that predominantly we go into a rural area, the last mile, using an existing contract that we have either won through tender or helping a customer. And most of our customers are DFIs or NGOs, and they are trying to get money to the last mile. So you'll find that our customer base will say, I really want to come and become your customer because I'm going to get access to this money. Where the education and where the Centric is, once you've distributed the funds digitally to the particular project on the last mile under the mango tree, you now need to create a network of merchants across the ecosystem. That's where the customer-centric comes into place, where you sit and talk with the various merchants and you look at what are their needs. Now, a merchant in the deep rural area who's selling mangoes and he's selling cigarettes or he's selling food, he or she works on a cash society. So now suddenly you're going to say, I'm going to take that cash away from me and digitize it. And firstly, it's the trust. What, are you taking all my money? So you've got to do a lot of educational programs. So we've got a team, what we call it, special projects. They go in before and after and educate not only the consumer, the person getting the money, but the merchants and the ecosystem. And what's quite interestingly, and just as a point for all your listeners, predominantly in all our 5 or 6 million people that we in 8 countries, over 50% of the people that we are distributing money to are women. And we find that the women quickly get it, and we find that they somehow are the ones that are trusted and immediately build the trust within their families. They keep the purse. So yes, customer-centric at the last mile needs a lot of education and understanding the goat versus the donkey versus the mango tree.
Great. Well, we've got some questions coming in, and I'm going to direct a few to Jose because you've gotten name checked. 2 for you. So the first one is for Jose at Comic Relief. It is apparent that reaching the last mile is crucial, but also complex. As a donor, how do you support ensure that all these aspects, profitability, customer experience, technology, are considered? And then the next one is, from a donor perspective, what measures can you put in place to ensure that grantees are employing consumer protection principles and/or financial capability modules when delivering last mile solutions? So 2 really easy questions for you, Jose.
Thank you for those 2 very easy questions. Just looking at them again now. So with the first one, how do we ensure that the work that is being carried out is done so in a proper manner and that is done so respectfully as well? So I'm very happy to say that well, we really take pride in the standing of the partners that we have. So this is the first initiative that Comic Relief is doing in financial inclusion. And one of the main things that we've done is really take the time to explore the sector. And to also divide the work that we're doing within phases. So at the moment, we're in our first phase of implementation, which is due to end in a year and a half's time. Of course, during this time, there has been a massive shift in the environment. And I mean, you've heard me say COVID-19 now several times. It has become somewhat my obsession. Really, this has been a gigantic change, and as I said earlier, really a great opportunity. So we're constantly involving ourselves in various conversations and supporting organizations such as CFI and initiatives such as IF50 to really identify those organizations, those FSPs that are best placed to be able to truly impact in the margins and in the 3 countries that we're working in. Sorry, Tamara, could you repeat the second question? I can't seem to find it.
Sure, and my internet's a little unstable, so let me know if you can't hear. But I think it's really looking at, just from a donor perspective, how do you take this into consideration? How do you encourage grantees to be thinking about customer centricity? I think there's probably a little bit of an undercurrent of how do you subsidize the last mile, but that's not what it says.
Right. Well, it's interesting, really. For us as a donor, at the moment, our customers, so to speak, in inverted commas, are 3, right? We have the final customers under the mango tree, as Ralph was saying. We've got the various regulatory bodies that we work with as well, that we're trying to support. And then we have the FSPs themselves. So that we're trying to support, as I was saying, with helping provide the type of environment that is conducive to good work by trying to put partnerships together as well. And we found that as interest in inclusive finance grows, we have seen these fintechs and investors and regulators really cooperate much more towards ensuring a regulatory framework that is conducive in that sense. So it is a constant conversation between these 3 parties. But at the end of the day, we are not prescriptive. We trust that the organizations that we work with are knowledgeable of the field. We trust that the regulatory bodies that we work with have their ears on the ground as well. And it is therefore our role to try to build bridges between these 3 groups. That has been our approach so far, and it has been quite successful. We're looking forward to continuing like this in the future. But it's the main way, really. Dialogue and ensuring that all 3 of these components are in balance, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you said, Jose. I'm going to go back because I skipped some questions because I wanted to give Jose a chance to answer the easy ones first. Ed Partners, who lends to affordable housing, affordable schools, has asked the panel whether you know of telcos who are helping out learners who've been sent home trying to do online, and their last mile doesn't seem to be phones or devices. Their last mile seems to be bundles, airtime. And does anybody know of anybody who's helping online learners with that situation? I was afraid the answer was no. Sorry, Ed Partners. Okay. The other question is a little bit related to the information again, but oh, sorry. How do you work on good disclosure of information without going in detriment of the UX? So, and Buhle, you talked a little bit about this. You talked about how you've got your terms and conditions, which are required, but you've tried to put into the user journey a way of helping people understand those. But how do those kind of requirements potentially have a detriment on UX, user design?
Yeah, I think a lot of this really comes down to making a judgment call, right, around what is actually essential. I think, we often bombard customers and not just last mile customers with information. I think what you need to get down to is, at this stage in the process, what does the customer actually need to know? Right, for them to be contracting from a position of strength, right? And typically, can I still get out of this? What are the consequences, the most important consequences? And I think those are the things that you communicate. And actually, when you communicate those things and you communicate them well, it isn't to the detriment of the UX, right? I'm reminded of a situation that we had on one of our products in Uganda, we were seeing drop-offs on a particular screen. And then when we did some dipstick surveys, we also realized that it was primarily women that were dropping off. And we wanted to understand what's the problem. And it was basically the language we used was very formal, and they didn't realize that at that point in the journey, they could still go back and they would be shown the full pricing, and they could still make a decision, you know, to go back, and we changed that in the journey, and we saw the drop-offs reducing, right? So really that disclosure of information, if you distill it to what is essential, I think that you'll be okay, and in fact you will enhance your user experience, because that trust comes from feeling like I know what is actually going to happen. One of the other things that we also did, actually, we did a multi-country study to just think about designing for women, because, you know, I always say it's not just about shrink it and pink it and then women will buy it. You really have to understand what is the anxiety that they have, and one of the things that we found, particularly with women who were less familiar with financial services, is they really wanted to know what is going to happen once I enter this journey. And so we actually worked with some of our mobile network partners to change the approach to marketing. Instead of nice images of people going, yes, I, you know, got a loan for my business, to actually show the journey so that the customer got a sense of what would happen, because we found out that this was actually causing a lot of anxiety. So I think, you know, the disclosure of information definitely does not need to, you know, deteriorate your user experience. And in fact, you can also think about multiple ways to almost layer that disclosure. So yes, you have it in your terms and conditions. Yes, some aspects of it are built into your actual digital customer journey. Can some of the aspects of it be outsourced to promotional material, to actual human beings? Because usually in all of our models, I think actually there's always a point of human interaction, right? Whether it's a mobile money agent or someone actually delivering the product. What aspects of that disclosure can you also deploy through those different touch points? So I think if you think about it creatively in that way, you can get over the risk of, you know, destroying the user experience.
Great, we've got a couple more questions coming in. There's one in this, how do you market your products and services to customers who only use basic phones? Are bulk SMSs the only way to do marketing via USSD, or what are your experiences and ideas? I'd also just like to say, for those following on the platform, there is a provider of airtime for learners that goes to NGOs. So look for the information there from PhoneBank. I'm not familiar with them, but looks like a good opportunity. Free advertising. All right. Anybody have a question? I know, Ralph, I think you do have a solution that works with basic phones. Do you want to take that one?
Well, in fact, for us, digital value is can go to a card or can go to a mobile phone or whatever. So for us, one can send through an USSD, or we could also send to a mobile app. So in particular, if we're in your particular case, the M-Pesa in Kenya is a very renowned mobile solution. So what we would do is we wouldn't want to replace the mobile wallet, we would want to integrate it. And we have a very strong belief, and that comes down to affordability and making sure that you're accessing those people that we're trying to get to, is that we don't want to replace or displace, we'd rather give fit for purpose. So if there's a particular customer that feels happy to use the mobile phone, even to use the data to do the transaction and has the funds to do so, then we will not go there and replace that person with a card or another tech. All we would do is then distribute the funds electronically to that mobile phone and do an integration. So we did that for a farmer grant system in Zambia, where it was funded by the UN or FAO, and they needed to get the inputs and outputs. And so what we needed to do is work with a mobile player. We then integrated with the local one there, and off we went. And so there was a mix and match of people wanting to use the phone or wanting to use the card or both. One of the things I want to also say...
We've only got 7 minutes left, and there's a bunch of more questions. So let this be your last point, and then I'll let the others answer one of the other questions.
I'm done. I'm done.
Okay, great. So
Okay,
we've got a question on female users and how the fact that a lot of your users, to Nick and Ralph, are female has affected your design. We've got some questions around again, how do you prevent fraud at the last mile using data and privacy issues. And then we were also hoping to talk about partnerships and adjacencies to our models. So Nick, I'll go to you, and you've got a minute to answer whichever of those you'd like.
I'll do my best on the question around gender and marketing. So look, for our product, we spend a lot of time, as I mentioned earlier, going into the household and trying to understand not just the dynamic around cooking and sourcing fuels, but also how decisions are made. We found our best customers are a female head of household that has their own mobile account, has some agency around their financial decisions, and is also making the cooking decisions, but it can be more complex than that. So we still believe that the cooking decision and the fuel decision is coming from usually from the woman in the household. And so one way to drive from a marketing perspective to also deal a little bit with some misinformation around LPG was to go to community groups and do cooking shows. And actually get people together. We're working in informal settlements. The word of mouth spreads really quickly. It was a great way to tap into these groups that are generally women led, and show the benefits of cooking with gas versus other dirty fuels. Actually show the different costs across these fuels, and give them the ammunition that they need to go back if it's the male head of household that's making the final decision financially, to explain the economics of it and why it will be better for the whole household. So we did focus specifically on women, and I think those kind of community-based approach was the right way to give them the ammunition they needed at home.
Great.
Hope that
Jose, last thoughts from you?
Really, I think what Nick has been saying really answered the question. We are also looking at the moment towards the future, towards future work that we will be funding. We're also looking at seeing how we can be more inclusive through some of the experiences that the various organizations that are part of IF50 have been looking at. So that's something that I'm certainly looking forward to interacting with all of you guys in the future as we design that.
Great, thanks. Buhle, last thoughts?
Yeah, I think, for me, it would just be also don't be afraid to partner, because that's how you go far. A lot of the things that we spoke about today, especially when it comes to designing for the last mile, require significant investment. In my experience, we've partnered with Smart Campaign, CGAP, Google, I spoke about the thin file strategies. We had a team working with some of the researchers at Google on that. So don't be afraid to partner with people who can actually help you, because for a lot of fintechs, you just don't have the level of investment required to do this. I think that's something to consider. And I think definitely principle-based design, be very clear on your principles and check on them all of the time, right? Am I driving access? Is this going to be empowering? Is there financial value here? Am I enhancing the broader ecosystem? So whatever the principles are in your business, have them and make sure that everything that you're doing is principle-based. And I think that we'll see tremendous progress in the next decade in reaching the last mile if we all do that together.
Yeah, that's great. A great way to end on partnerships. Well, as Abby has said in the chat, for those of you who are following it, there's a networking room set up called Reaching the Last Mile that the panelists and any of the attendees are welcome to go to if you want to keep the conversation going. As we wrap up, I'd just like to kind of highlight a couple of things that stood out to me as we discussed. One of the things that stood out was the intersection between physical and digital. Some people call it phygital. And how important that is when reaching the last mile. And Buhle talked about, leveraging the mobile money agent who does have that physical interaction, or, and Nick talked about the importance of physical distribution, but then leveraging that digital and looking at how those can work together. Building on the partnerships point that so many of you talked about, what you can do together. Reaching that last mile is expensive. And so if there's somebody else who maybe is a competitor or isn't a competitor, and there's a way you could reach that last mile together. It could be that it could deal with some of those margin questions that we talked about almost at the very beginning of the session. There was also a real discussion around COVID-19, of course, and how the digital onboarding of people before COVID-19 helped reach them. But I would like to just say that there's still a lot of people who haven't been reached by Paycode or who don't have a mobile money account. And when everything was sent digitally, the risk of people being those who actually probably needed the most, not getting those if they hadn't been onboarded before. I think that's one of those last mile challenges that we're facing. Trying to think if there's anything else that really stood out. I love that there was not initially a question on gender, and yet gender kept coming up, because gender is a very big last mile issue for lots of different reasons. And then I guess I'll go back to the very beginning. When we define the last mile, it's not just geographic, right? It's really, it can be about mindset. It can be about ability, capability. It can be all kinds of different things that can prevent these financial solutions from fintechs from reaching the people that most need these solutions to work. So with that, let me thank this fantastic group of panelists. One of these things about these, there's no way for you to all do the virtual applause, but please join me in thanking this group. And I hope this conversation doesn't end here, that it keeps going. Thanks for the great questions in the chat. And congratulations to Paycode and PayGo for being part of the Inclusive Fintech 50. Great.
Thank you.
I think
Thank
we're
you.
at time.